Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show here on Facebook Live and the only place where Shaka answers your questions. I'm Jackson Vunganya, host of Upfront. I'm sitting in for Paul Diho, and here with me in the studio is Shaka Sali himself. How are you doing, Shaka, today?
I am doing hugely terrific.
Happy holidays, my friend.
Happy holidays to you.
So I'm kind of curious, how did you used to celebrate holidays growing up in Kabale?
When I was a little kid growing up in Kabale, I couldn't wait for Christmas. And this was really for very selfish, personal, greed reasons. Because Christmas meant that I could have unfettered access almost to as much rice as I wanted, as much chicken.
Rice a delicacy in your area?
Exactly, yeah. Because it was imported, my brother. I could look forward to having a new shirt, a new pair of shorts, and sometimes a new shoe.
So, a new pair of shoes?
Yeah, and I could go to church with an envelope in which my parents had inserted in some money so that I could also look like I'm contributing to Christianity, my brother. And so I really couldn't wait for Christmas. But when I grow older and older and began in some way to gain the ability and the capability of doing those types of things anytime I wanted, then my mind really shifted to what my neighbors in Rwanda and Burundi used to call Ubunani.
New Year's.
The New Year.
Yes. Yeah. So you celebrate more the New Year than you did Christmas.
The New Year seems to make much more sense for me, frankly, than Christmas.
So as you got older, less Christmas, more Bunani.
Yeah.
Celebrating a New Year.
Yes. And besides, I don't really have to look forward to have unlimited access to plenty of rice.
You can eat as much rice as you want now. Precisely, at any point.
Precisely.
So the kid from Kabale,
yes,
who got very small rations of rice once a year on the 25th of December, now has access to as much rice as he wants. So Shaka, our listeners your listeners and viewers from around the continent sent in questions. Lots of questions, diverse questions covering a range of issues. But I want to start off with getting your understanding of your show last week, last Wednesday, Straight Talk Africa. Do you feel that conversation led somewhere? Did you have a great conversation? How did the show go in general?
You know, I don't know why you use such a word as a conversation, because the last time I checked, when I look at reaction from social media, everyone pretty much says there was no conversation, really. Because in order for you to have a conversation, you have to have two parties. But in this particular case, as much as the Rwandan minister...
Let's refresh our listeners on what exactly you were talking about. What was the topic?
We were basically looking at the issue of the recent release of political prisoners.
In Rwanda?
Yes, and whether in fact that probably meant that we were entering a new era of political...
Openness, I guess, right, opening up space, political space, right.
Tolerance, that kind of stuff. But the government minister...
And you had a diverse panel of people from different sides,
we were
with
fortunate,
different views.
Of course, to be blessed with the presence and the participation of the Rwandan minister for the East African community, Ambassador Olivier Nduhungirehe, and we also had a recent political prisoner, at least that's what she says, even though the minister disagreed with her, because as far as he is concerned, Rwanda does not hold who you would characterize as political prisoners. So we're talking about Victoire Ingabire Umuhoza. And then we
recently released
right. Via presidential clearance. And then we were, of course, also joined by Aristide Rwigara, who happens to be a brother of Diana Rwigara, who tried to dare to become the president of the Republic of Rwanda. But unfortunately for her, she was not she did not get the opportunity to stand.
Why didn't you have Diane Rigara herself on the show?
Well, Diane Rigara had some logistical problems to deal with, and so we eventually compromised.
So did you feel that conversation or that discussion?
Of course, by the way, if you don't mind, we also had Claude Gatebuche, who happened to be a Rwandan living in the diaspora and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
And your assessment of the discussion or the conversation was that it did not amount to a lot of, conversation?
Well, because you see, it was really funny, and it reminded me of a long time ago when I used to host programs regarding the Sudan. Before you had the Sudan and the Southern Sudan. You would never have a situation sometimes, frankly, where you could expect to moderate, for example, a conversation between those who represented Khartoum and those people who were following people like then Colonel Dr. John Garang,
So there was a divergence of opinion, but also there was an unwillingness to engage.
The government people would say that they do not really feel comfortable breathing in the same air with their political opponents.
Is that the sense you got from having these different individuals on your panel last week?
Not only did I get the sense, Jackson, it was pretty much obvious because the minister was very categorical. He said apparently when he came on the air, the compromise was that he would only talk with Shaka Sali, the moderator from Washington. He would, under no circumstances, interact with his compatriots who happen to have a different point of view, obviously not in sync, not on the same page with the predominant point of view from Kigali.
But I'm obviously knowing you as a great moderator that you were, you probably had both, all sides of the of this topic well covered, and you're able to ask them to contribute to a great conversation. At least that's what I heard from some of the people that were watching.
I frankly hate to disappoint you, and I'm saying this from the deepest, better part of the bottom of my Kabale heart and soul, that I failed miserably to create an environment, sincerely, that would have been able to allow all the parties to interact, or at least to be seen to be essentially working on the same page.
Right. Let's not call it a lost cause.
I was told that at the end of the day, it looked like it was a show where I had several different interviews. And yet, this was supposed to be a show where these people were supposed to be interacting. You would have expected point, counterpoint, and all that kind of stuff. Which is the normal
I think it's also, it's not easy when they're not in the same setting. You had someone on Skype, others in different geographical locations. If you had them on set, it's a different ballgame altogether when you have people in the same room.
Yeah, but I remember when I also at one time hosted a show before South Africa was liberated, the apartheid officials did not want to talk to people who they characterized as communists, as terrorists, the ANC, and all that kind of stuff. It took a very long time, and the guy, in fact, that opened up that space was, in fairness to this great journalist that I admired when I was in school, and still admire him in his retirement, it was Ted Kapo of ABC News with his Nightline that actually ended up probably doing the first show that was able to bring the officials under apartheid and the Tabumbekis of the world at the time who were, of course, supporting the ANC in exile and kind of stuff. But these are people that...
he was able to bring them together on a table and have a conversation. He was able to bring them
together. Some of them were essentially joining the conversation via remote, locations and all that kind of stuff. So it was not necessarily the issue of logistics, really. It was the issue of attitude and mindset. And I think, frankly, let's face it, if you are going to claim that you have democracy, that you have a society that is open, as Ambassador Olivier Nduhungirehe was actually saying, You cannot do that unless you allow the issue that is called dialogue. You cannot dialogue alone. If you don't dialogue with someone else, and sometimes someone that in fact happens to have views that may not necessarily be on the same page with yours, the English experts call it a monologue. And frankly, you cannot claim to have democracy unless you are ready to enter into the business of dialogue.
But that's where you come in as a moderator to move it from the monologue to the dialogue.
Unfortunately, I think last Wednesday I did not quite succeed, but I hope that at some point in the future that is going to have to happen, because let's face it, I admire the U.S. 41st President, H.W. Bush, especially when he used to say, I want a kinder, and I think he wanted a kinder, gentler America. And I think sincerely, Africans, we should begin to say, we want a kinder, gentler Africa.
Right.
And Africa belongs to all of us.
Right.
If you are Rwandese, you all have the same amount of
interest in its prosperity.
Precisely.
Right,
you have shares.
Right.
You know, Rwanda does not belong to particular individuals. It does not. So you shouldn't claim to have a monopoly. And if you are a minister or a president, it is not a personal thing. You are representing a constituency. You are representing people's interests, and your interest, honestly, is in being a bridge builder, not a wall builder.
Right. Thank you very much for that, Shaka. Let's go to our first question here from a gentleman by the names of Tamale Bashir from Mityana, Uganda, and he asks you, Shaka, what do you think about that huge blazing fire on the DRC's Congo Electoral Commission headquarters? Do you think that it is politically motivated? Lots of DRC questions in the last 3 conversations we've had together. So much at stake here. So many people watching, hoping for the best outcome. There were clashes over the weekend between opposing, parties. I think candidates had flown in on the same airport, and their supporters had clashed. But generally, up to now, things seem to be going, leading to the direction of a peaceful election on the 23rd. Do you see any nefarious activities on the side of the government and I guess in what this gentleman here, Tamale Bashir from Uganda, is alluding to, could be politically motivated fire on the Congo Electoral Commission headquarters?
First of all, I would like to assure Tamale Bashir that I do not have any empirical evidence, any incontrovertible evidence or hard or credible evidence on that. And so I would not wish really to get into the business of speculation, guesswork, and what have you. I can only hope that it wasn't politically motivated. But you see, in the circumstances of a country, of a society, which is not very much well known for accountability.
Right.
When something like that, also in the sense that
when it happens, you see red flags.
Yes,
basically.
you have a background where, for example, incumbent President Joseph Kabila delayed this upcoming election for about 2 years, and where people thought he was probably going to hang on to power and all that kind of stuff, then you shouldn't be surprised that people begin
questioning when such things happen.
Precisely.
Right. Shaka, let's go to another question, second question. I know we don't want to run out of time without getting to many of our questions here. Wongi Churchill Nyirenda from Mlowe, Malawi asks, Malawi, a country you've been to?
Beautiful country,
right.
And it is very interesting that among his names is Churchill.
Churchill.
Perhaps lifted from Winston Churchill.
Right. So it's a very common name in Malawi. Yes. So Mr. Churchill here asks Shaka, what is your view on Africa in 20 years to come? Basically asks you to be a foreseer, foretell with things that are going to happen. Should Africa unite and be one country? And what's your input on that?
Well, I think my input would be very simple. I would definitely, to a certain degree, agree with Churchill that I want to see an Africa not only that is kinder and gentler, but in fact, an Africa that removes these artificial boundaries that benefit other people, not Africans. And I am surprised, frankly, that the leaders of the African continent, or the rulers of the African continent, somehow they don't even seem to be talking about this. Or if they talk about it, they don't seem to make sure that they can actually walk that talk so that the Africans can walk the walk. Can you imagine what sort of a superpower Africa would be?
Absolutely.
Look at her enormous wealth. We are very busy helping other countries to become or to claim the position or the honor of being superpowers. Look at China. I was talking with a friend yesterday, and I was saying, in our generation, we've seen Chinese under Chairman Mao Zedong. They all used to dress in the same cloth, uniform. Basically, what you would say is the transport of choice at that time was a bicycle.
Yes.
So you couldn't even think in terms of freeways, highways, and what have you. But my friend, now you're talking about skyscrapers.
Right.
You're talking about Chinese being the second largest economy in the world.
Right, and you're also talking about China being a colonial power.
Well, I don't know about colonial power, but probably by another name.
I mean, that is what many analysts are looking at. Some of the interest on the continent.
Playing a very, very
but you make a very
role.
great point. In the 60s and the 70s, many of these Asian economies were almost on the same level as our African economies.
A lot of African countries, yeah.
And look at it now. We're receiving foreign aid.
So what's wrong with Africa? I think that in fact, if there is anybody who is going to make a difference, it is going to have to be the younger generation, the changing demographics,
right,
in tandem with social media.
Right.
Because for the first time, Jackson, young people in Africa have an opportunity to be exposed.
Right.
Social media has,
and to
in
speak
a sense,
out.
Precisely. Social media, in a sense, has actually become an equal opportunity employer.
Right.
But when you look at like a guy like me and those who came before me, we were what I called beneficiaries of the Gutenberg factor.
Right.
The printing press.
Yes. If you're just joining us, this is Shaka Extra Time. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. I'm in the studio here with Shaka Sali himself. He's taking your questions and answering them as they come in. Our next question is from Bishop Clarence Baisa, who asks, Shaka, what do you think causes corruption in Africa, and what causes for the young people who are leaving Africa? I guess it means the issue of migration that we covered last week. What are some of the causes? What are some of the push and pull factors that are leading to thousands of young people leaving the continent, leading many of them to die, obviously, on the Mediterranean, taking a very dangerous journey going to Europe. And I will couple that with the question from Abuja, Nigeria. The first question was about, what corruption, and then migration. And the third one will be, I guess, Nigeria from Nobo Chinendum, who asks, is politics a do-or-die affair with Nigeria as a case study? So you will decide which one of the three you decide to take first.
Well, first of all, I think that corruption, frankly, is the thing, because without, in fact, curbing corruption, Africa is not going to go anywhere. Look at the world as it is so far. We talk about, for example, Singapore. When we talk about Singapore, we are reminded of a man called Lee Kuan Yew.
Yes, yes.
A man who was prime minister of that city-state for at least 31 years. And in those 31 years, that man was able to lift that island, that city-state, from a third world, very, very underdeveloped, much underdeveloped than Uganda, Kenya, and countries like Ghana, to the position of a first world. As we talk, Singapore is one of the largest financial centers or capitals around the world. If you fly around the United States or in Europe and what have you, you run into some of these 747 Boeings, which form Singapore Airlines. It is certainly one of the best airlines, rated very highly, almost consistently. One of the things he did was to instill discipline among his people. And he was personally responsible for curbing corruption. In Singapore, if you were a minister or a senior government official, and you ended up actually misusing or abusing the money of the people and what have you, you had better commit suicide. Yeah. Because if you don't commit suicide, you know what he's going to do to you. Now, he's going to put you in prison and throw away the key.
Now, Lee Kuan Yew has been thrown around as an inspiration to some of Africa's leaders, including President Paul Kagame. They say that they've compared him many times as the Lee Kuan Yew of the continent. He's pulling the country out of poverty. Rwanda, one of the least corrupt countries on the continent. Do you feel that Lee Kuan Yew's, Lee Kuan Yew's power came from his staying power, having stayed long in power to be able to enact some of these reforms in his country?
First of all, before I go to the issue of staying power, I do not see, frankly, any empirical evidence, any incontrovertible evidence, not liable to falter, that can actually genuinely compare and contrast the Republic of Rwanda and the Singapore city-state. The two are like day and night. The only area where, for example, they probably come on the same page is in terms of the limitation of freedoms of press, freedom of expression and stuff like that. But Lee Kuan Yew was a Singaporean nationalist. Lee Kuan Yew inherited through large segments of society. He came from the Chinese aspect of Singapore. His father had two lorries, by the way. So he had a good life, and he was able to go to Cambridge and get a first class in law. Lee Kuan Yew, for example, the house he built before he got into politics, is the same house he was living in at the time, actually, he dies. Lee Kuan Yew had two children, one daughter who was a doctor. At one time, in fact, she was doing some kind of residency in Toronto. And then, of course, had a son who happens to be the current, I think, if I remember well, the current Prime Minister of Singapore, a man who actually was a brigadier general in the Singaporean army and also had an MBA from Stanford to boot.
Right.
So, but the thing is, Lee Kuan Yew was a man who looked at the Malays, who were the majority of the people, but were economically, socially backward. He was able to help them, meet their elders, and convince them and persuade them to help him so that he can help them help Singapore. It was good for everybody to be on the same page. There was also a group which, of course, was reflected of Indians. So there were Indians, there were Malays, and there were Chinese.
Right, a very, very diverse community, and was able to bring all three
He was a uniter.
Forces.
Yeah, he did not divide the people so he can take advantage of them. And when he organized elections, by the way, they were elections. They were not selections. To the extent that, in fact, his party was consistently voted in power precisely because of what it was able to deliver to the people.
Right.
It was not about an election whose results do not reflect the will of the people, but reflect the will of the people, officials who count the vote, who use the terminology of creative accounting,
right.
all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
If you're just joining us, this is Shaka Extra Time. I'm Jackson Vunganyi. This is Shaka Sally. I know we have a lot to get to, some questions that you we never had a chance to get to, including the migration issue. If we don't get to your question this time around, next Tuesday we'll be here and Shaka will answer your questions. But Shaka, before we go, I know we're running short of time. I want us to look at what is happening on Straight Talk Africa this week, tomorrow. What are you going to talk about?
We are looking at what really needed to happen on the African continent in order for the continent to begin developing seriously and beginning to, in a sense, to get its rightful place on this planet Earth. And until and unless we are in a position where we control the selection of our leaders, and we're talking about elections, not selections here, unless we are in a position where we can begin to hold elections that are seen to be credible, that are seen to be free, seem to be fair, seem to be verifiable, so that every stakeholder honestly feels that they are on the same page in terms of playing the ball game. But the situation right now is where you have, for example, an incumbent president, and in most of Africa, really, you have that situation. An incumbent president is the same person who actually chooses members of the electoral commission. Is the same. It's just like having imagine having a football game, and that when you go to a stadium, that stadium, first of all, is chosen by one of the participants. The referee is chosen by the same individual. The linesmen or women are chosen by the same individual. The ball is chosen by the same individual. And to a certain degree, even the spectators are chosen by the same individual.
Right, so it's not a level playing field.
There is no level playing field. We have to begin seriously having a level playing field where everybody who actually votes and registers and votes, that person's vote counts. We have to begin respecting the people that give us this opportunity to serve. We have to begin looking at ourselves as servant leaders, not rulers. Because the way we are right now, we are just deceiving ourselves. How can you, for example, imagine a country, rather a continent, which is perhaps, arguably, the wealthiest on this planet Earth, and yet its daughters and sons are the poorest? It doesn't make sense. We have actually been in the business of helping other countries, other parts of the world become rich. You know, I'm reminded of this book which was written by the Ghanaian, the Guyanese intellectual.
I know who you're talking
the late,
about.
of course, Walter Rodney.
Walter Rodney, yes.
How he wrote a book about how Europe underdeveloped Africa.
Yeah.
He could, in fact, have written the same book and said how Africa developed Europe
absolutely.
And probably North America.
Very interesting, Shaka. And with that, we want to thank you, Shaka Sally, for answering those questions. For all of you who never had a chance to have your questions answered by Shaka, we'll be here next week. He will answer your questions. But I want to thank you for joining us today and for watching. Remember to catch the show tomorrow, Straight Talk Africa on VOA. We're online, on TV, on whatever platform you'll be watching us. We'll catch you again here in the studio 47 with Shaka Sally next Tuesday. My name is Jackson Vunganyi, and have a nice day, Africa.
If I had an opportunity, I would have asked you the question.